Born into Park Avenue wealth and hailed as the most beautiful woman in movie history, Jean Tierney seemed to possess the ultimate fairy tale life. She had patrician beauty, iconic roles, and powerful romances with men like JFK. But beneath the shimmering surface of Hollywood's high society lay a devastating living hell. Driven by the crushing guilt of her daughter's tragic birth defect, her life descended into a darkness of mental asylums and brutal shock treatments. Her life proves a terrifying thesis: the fragility of blue blood. Being old money didn't protect her. In fact, the very walls built to keep her safe, the politeness, the silence, and the expectations of the elite, were exactly what left her defenseless against the brutality of fame. Jean Tierney was American royalty. She was a wealthy debutante, educated in Switzerland, and the lover of John F. Kennedy. She had everything that money could buy. At her lowest point, Tierney was hospitalized and underwent 27 sessions of electroconvulsive therapy, an experience she later said caused serious memory loss. Jean Eliza Tierney was born in 1920 to a life of envy-inducing comfort. Her father, Howard Tierney, was a wealthy insurance broker. Her mother, Belle, was a former teacher turned society matron. Howard Tierney ruled his house like a corporation. He was handsome, stern, and obsessed with appearances. To Jean, he wasn't just a father, he was an idol. She was daddy's girl, and she worshipped him. He was her protector and her moral compass. This intense adoration is crucial because when he eventually betrayed her, it didn't just break her heart, it shattered her reality. In the Tierney household, emotions were a liability. Jean was taught that anger was vulgar and sadness was impolite. She learned to suppress everything behind a perfect smile. This emotional discipline would later make her a great actress, but it was a disaster for her mental health. She was learning to dissociate from her pain before she was even a teenager. In her mid-teens, Tierney spent 2 years at Brillenmont, a boarding school in Switzerland. While the world was inching toward war, Jean was learning how to pour tea and speak fluent French. It was a factory for charm, designed to turn wild American girls into obedient wives for bankers and diplomats. But Jean was bored. Beneath the polished exterior, she had the soul of an artist. She wrote poetry. She looked at the mountains and felt trapped. She returned to the U.S. in 1936 and later attended Miss Porter's School, emerging as a polished young debutante. But she was already planning her escape. The turning point came during a family trip to the West Coast. The Tierneys visited Warner Brothers studios as tourists. Director Anatole Litvak spotted the 17-year-old Jean walking through the lot. Struck by her unique beauty, the high cheekbones and translucent green eyes, he told her, "Young lady, you ought to be in pictures." It wasn't a pickup line. Warner Brothers showed interest, but her parents advised her to pursue legitimate theater instead. Warner Brothers immediately offered her a contract. Jean was ecstatic. This was her way out of the boring debutante life. Her parents discouraged the studio contract at the time, and Tierney was steered toward the legitimate stage. To Howard, Hollywood was low class. Respectable women did not paint their faces for money. He dragged the family back to Connecticut. Jean was devastated, but the seed was planted. She now knew she had value beyond her last name. Back in the East Coast, Jean was forced into the debutante season. It was a parade of parties designed to find her a husband. Jean called it a cattle auction. She couldn't take it anymore. She gave her father an ultimatum. "If I can't act, I'm going to get a job. I'll scrub the floors if I have to, but I won't just sit here." Howard Tierney was a pragmatist. The thought of his daughter working a menial job was more humiliating than her becoming an actress. He relented, but with conditions. She could try acting, but only on the legitimate stage, Broadway, and he would manage everything. Jean hit Broadway in 1939. Critics slammed her acting, but praised her presence. The New York Times called her refreshingly modest. She worked tirelessly to lower her high-pitched society voice, smoking cigarettes to deepen it. It worked. Darrell F. Zanuck of 20th Century Fox saw her in a play and was mesmerized. He offered her a contract. This time, the money was too good for Howard Tierney to ignore. He said yes. Before Jean left for Hollywood, Howard sat her down for a business meeting. Young and inexperienced, she relied heavily on her father to manage the business side of her early career. Her father set up a corporation called Tierney to fund and promote her acting career, a structure that later became a source of bitter conflict. It would pay her expenses and a small allowance, and invest the rest for her future. Jean agreed to the arrangement, trusting her father's judgment at the time. Why would she? This was her father, the man she worshipped. She trusted him with her life. She didn't know she had just signed her own warrant. The corporation was structured to give Howard total control. He wasn't protecting her future. He was securing his own retirement. In 1940, Jean Tierney boarded a train to Hollywood. She felt triumphant. She had escaped the gilded cage of Connecticut. She was young, beautiful, and about to become a star. But she was walking into a trap. She was entering a world of wolves with nothing but her manners to protect her. And looming in the near future was a war, a fateful handshake, and a tragedy that would make her wish she had never left home. This section covers her meteoric rise in Hollywood, the shattering betrayal by her father, and the tragic event that would define the rest of her life. When Jean Tierney arrived in Hollywood in 1940, the studio system was a factory. It built stars like Ford built cars. You were the vamp, the girl next door, or the funny sidekick. But Jean didn't fit the mold. She was too refined to be a sex symbol, but too exotic to be the girl next door. Darrell F. Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox, famously said she was undoubtedly the most beautiful woman in movie history, but he didn't know how to use her. She was initially cast in roles that focused only on her face, not her talent. But Jean was determined to be more than a mannequin. She worked hard to reshape her stage voice and screen presence, determined not to be treated as a decorative debutante. And then came Laura. It was the film that turned her into an icon. In it, she plays a woman so compelling that a detective falls in love with her just by looking at her painting. It wasn't acting, it was destiny. She became the dream girl of the 1940s. Soldiers pinned her photo in their bunks. Men wrote her thousands of love letters. She had the world at her feet. But behind the scenes, the two pillars of her life, her father and her health, were about to crumble. Jean had been a dutiful daughter her entire life. She had signed the contracts her father wanted. She had dated the men her mother approved of. But in 1941, she met Oleg Cassini. Cassini was everything Howard Tierney hated. He was a costume designer, not a banker. He was Russian, he was penniless, and worst of all, he was divorced. To the Tierney family, he was a fortune hunter. Howard Tierney forbade Jean from seeing him. For the first time in her life, Jean said no. The war in Europe had made life feel fragile. Jean realized she was living for everyone else but herself. In a moment of frantic rebellion, she and Oleg eloped to Las Vegas. She expected her father to be angry. She did not expect him to declare war. Howard Tierney cut her off. He refused to speak to her. But he did more than that. He used his position as her manager to punish her. He leaked stories to the press painting Oleg as a villain. The perfect family was fracturing in public view. The estrangement from her father was painful, but the true knife in the back was yet to come. In 1942, seeking to separate her finances from her father after the marriage, Jean's lawyers looked into the books of the Tierney Corporation. the company Howard had set up to protect her earnings. What they found was devastating. The accounts were empty. Howard Tierney hadn't just managed her money, he had stolen it. He had used his daughter's movie star salary to prop up his failing insurance business, pay off his own debts, and fund his lavish lifestyle. He had taken everything. When Jean confronted him, there was no apology. Instead, Howard Tierney, her idol, her daddy, sued her. He sued his own daughter for $50,000 for breach of contract, claiming she owed him for his management services. It destroyed Jean. The man who had taught her about honor and reputation was a thief. She won the legal battle, but she lost her father. The stress was unbearable. She was 22 years old, pregnant, estranged from her parents, and working 12-hour days on set to pay the legal bills. She thought this was the rock bottom. She was wrong. 1943. The world was burning. Like many stars, Jean felt a patriotic duty to support the troops. She volunteered at the Hollywood Canteen, a club where servicemen could meet movie stars before shipping out to war. Jean was pregnant with her first child. It was a time of anxiety but also hope. This baby represented a new start, a family of her own, separate from the toxicity of the Tierneys. One night, the canteen was packed. The air was thick with smoke and sweat. A Marine quarantine had just been lifted, or so everyone thought. Jean stood in the receiving line for hours, shaking hands, signing autographs, smiling that perfect Tierney smile. She noticed one female fan in particular, a Marine, who stared at her with intense, feverish adoration. The woman shook Jean's hand firmly, refusing to let go, beaming with excitement. Jean smiled back, thanked her, and moved to the next soldier. A few days later, Jean woke up feeling weak. She looked in the mirror and saw red spots on her face. It was rubella. In 2024, we know that rubella is catastrophic for pregnant women. In 1943, the medical understanding was less publicized. Doctors told her to rest. She recovered quickly. The spots faded. She thought the danger had passed. On October 15, 1943, she gave birth in Washington, D.C. to her daughter, Antoinette Daria. It was immediately apparent that something was wrong. Daria was tiny, weighing about 3 pounds 2 ounces. She was unresponsive. As the weeks went by, the truth revealed itself in horrifying layers. Daria was deaf. She was partially blind with cataracts, and she was severely mentally disabled. The doctors sat Jean down and explained the biology. The rubella virus had crossed the placenta during the critical first trimester. It had ravaged the fetus's developing brain and senses. Jean was crushed. She looked at her beautiful broken child and felt a wave of guilt that would never leave her. She wondered, where did I get the virus? Who gave this to me? For 2 years it remained a mystery, a cruel accident of fate. Years later, she wrote that the source of the infection was revealed to her at a social event. The war was over. Jean was at a garden party in Los Angeles. She was approached by a woman, a former member of the women's branch of the Marine Corps. The woman was smiling. She wanted to share a funny story with her favorite actress. She said, "Ms. Tierney, you probably don't remember me, but I met you at the Hollywood Canteen 2 years ago. I wasn't supposed to be there. I had German measles, and the camp was under quarantine, but I sneaked out. I just had to meet you. You were my favorite." The woman paused, waiting for Jean to laugh at her dedication. Jean stood frozen. The champagne glass in her hand didn't break, but something inside her did. She was looking at the person who had destroyed her daughter's life. This woman hadn't meant to hurt anyone. She had done it out of love, out of fandom, because she just had to meet her. Jean didn't scream. She didn't strike the woman. She simply turned and walked away. In her autobiography, Tierney wrote, "After that, I didn't care if I was ever again anyone's favorite actress. This was the breaking point. The betrayal by her father had taken her money. The love of her fan had taken her child. Jean Tierney was now a woman surrounded by ghosts, trapped in a marriage that was failing, with a career she no longer valued. The old money armor was gone. The cracks in the porcelain were beginning to show, and waiting in the wings were the demons of mental illness, ready to step through the breach. After the revelation of the handshake, Jean Tierney was a woman divided. To the public, she was still the radiant star of Leave Her to Heaven, playing a woman whose jealousy was lethal. She received an Academy Award nomination for the role. It was her career peak. But privately, she was living in a silent hell. The knowledge that her fame had cost her daughter's future was a poison in her blood. The doctors gave her advice that was standard for the 1940s, but barbaric to modern ears. They told her that Daria would never recognize her. They told her to institutionalize the child and move on with her life. They said, "You are young, you can have other children, forget this one." Jean resisted. She fought to keep Daria home. But the reality of Daria's condition, the constant care, the lack of recognition, was crushing. Eventually, with a broken heart, she placed Daria in a special home. Jean paid for Daria's care for the rest of her life. She never forgot. But the guilt of sending her away created a fissure in her psyche. She had failed as a daughter, and now she felt she had failed as a mother. Her marriage to Oleg Cassini could not survive the weight of this grief. They were two people drowning, trying to use each other as life rafts. They separated, reconciled, and finally divorced in 1952. Jean was now alone. She was rich, famous, and beautiful. She was the ultimate prize. And the wolves of the high society she had tried to escape began to circle again. In 1946, on the set of the film Dragonwyck, Jean Tierney met a young naval officer turned politician. His name was John F. Kennedy. He was 29. She was 26. Jack Kennedy was not yet the president. He was a skinny, charismatic congressman from Massachusetts. But he carried the same old money aura that Jean had grown up with. They spoke the same language of boarding schools and summer homes. The attraction was electric. Jean fell hard. For the first time since Daria's birth, she felt hope. Jack was funny, intelligent, and ambitious. He made her laugh. They spent weekends in whispered intimacy. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect American couple, the prince of politics and the queen of Hollywood. Jean began to dream of a life in Washington. She imagined leaving the vulgar movie business behind to become a political wife, a role she had been trained for since birth. But she had forgotten the first rule of the blue blood world: dynasty comes before love. The Kennedy family was the most ambitious clan in America, and the patriarch, Joe Kennedy, had a master plan. His son would be the first Catholic president of the United States. There was a problem. Jean Tierney was a divorcee. In the strict Catholic dogma of the 1940s, marrying a divorced woman was a sin. But politically, it was suicide. A Catholic candidate already faced prejudice. Marrying a Hollywood actress with a failed marriage would alienate the conservative vote. Jean flew to New York to meet the Kennedy family. She charmed them. But charm wasn't enough. One afternoon, over a lunch that felt like an execution, Jack Kennedy looked at the most beautiful woman in the world and told her the truth. "You know I can never marry you, Jean." He didn't say he didn't love her. He said he couldn't. His ambition and his father's command were stronger than his heart. Jean was devastated. She realized that to the Kennedys, she wasn't a person. She was a liability. She was the actress. Once again, her profession, the thing that gave her freedom, was used to deem her unworthy. She ended the relationship. Years later, when JFK became president and married Jacqueline Bouvier, A woman who fit the Catholic aristocrat mold perfectly, Jean sent him a note of congratulations. She never spoke ill of him, but the rejection reinforced a dangerous belief in her mind. I am not enough. No matter how famous I am damaged goods. Rebounding from JFK, Jean sought escape. She found it in Prince Ali Khan. Ali Khan was the son of the Aga Khan, the spiritual leader of the Ismaili Muslims and one of the richest men on earth. Ali was the world's most famous playboy. He was a whirlwind of private jets, racehorses, and diamonds. He swept Jean off her feet. He offered her a life where she didn't have to work, didn't have to think, didn't have to be Jean Tierney, the star. She could just be a princess. They traveled Europe. They danced until dawn. It was a desperate, manic kind of happiness. Jean was running from the memory of the handshake, running from the memory of Jack Kennedy. But history repeated itself with cruel precision. When Ali Khan proposed, his father, the Aga Khan, intervened. He threatened to disinherit Ali if he married another Hollywood actress. The message was the same. You are not one of us. Jean, exhausted by the rejection, ended the engagement. She returned to Hollywood alone. She was now in her early 30s. She had been rejected by the American aristocracy and the international aristocracy. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman who had failed at love 3 times. The cracks in her soul began to widen. By 1954, the internal pressure became too much. The brain can only compartmentalize so much trauma before it shatters. It started with small things. Jean, who had always been a professional, began to forget her lines. Not just a word here or there, she would blank out completely. She described it later as falling into a hole. On the set of The Left Hand of God with Humphrey Bogart, a man known for his toughness, noticed something was wrong. Jean wasn't just forgetting lines, she was terrified. She would tremble before takes. Bogart, whose own wife Lauren Bacall was a close friend of Jean's, tried to help. He coached her, he was patient. He told the studio she was just tired. He knew she was unraveling. The black dog of depression had moved into her house. Jean began to sleep for 12-14 hours a day. She lost interest in food. She stopped reading scripts. She would sit in her living room staring at a wall, unable to summon the energy to stand up. The press called it exhaustion. It's the Hollywood euphemism for a breakdown. But this wasn't exhaustion. This was the collapse of a lifetime of suppressed emotion. The grief for Daria, the betrayal by her father, the rejections by her lovers. It all came crashing down at once. In 1955, Jean Tierney was admitted to the Harkness Pavilion in New York, and later the Institute of Living in Connecticut. She was 34 years old. She thought she was going there to rest. She thought she would talk to a doctor, cry a little, and get better. She didn't know she was entering the darkest chapter of her life. Psychiatry in the 1950s was a blunt instrument. Doctors believed that depression in women was a chemical imbalance that could be reset, like a faulty circuit breaker. The treatment of choice was electroconvulsive therapy. Jean Tierney, the woman whose face had captivated millions, was strapped to a table. A rubber block was placed in her mouth. Electrodes were attached to her temples. A high-voltage current was sent through her brain. She didn't have 1 session. She didn't have 5. She endured 27 shock treatments. Inside the hospital, she was no longer a star. She was a patient. Her jewelry was taken. Her clothes were taken. Even her name seemed to be stripped away. The electricity induced grand mal seizures. The theory was that the seizure would reset the brain, but the side effects were catastrophic. When Jean woke up from these sessions, she felt empty. Huge chunks of her memory were gone. She couldn't remember the names of her friends. She couldn't remember the plots of her own movies. Worst of all, she couldn't remember the face of her daughter, Daria, as a baby. It was like trying to read a book where half the pages had been torn out. she later wrote. The doctors said the memory loss was temporary. It wasn't. Years of her life were permanently deleted. Jean began to fear the doctors more than her depression. Desperation reached a breaking point. She realized that if she stayed, there would be nothing left of Jean Tierney to save. So, she plotted an escape. She waited for a moment of distraction. She slipped out of the ward. She didn't have a plan. She just ran. She made it to a nearby town. She tried to blend in. But even in a hospital gown with disheveled hair, the face was unmistakable. Someone recognized her. The police were called. The Hollywood icon was surrounded by officers and escorted back to the asylum. She wasn't a criminal. She was a woman trying to save her own mind. The lock turned with a finality that echoed in her heart. However, the aggressive treatments eventually stopped, and she was released into the care of her family. But she was not cured. She was broken. This leads to the terrifying climax in 1957. Jean was staying at her mother's apartment in Manhattan. The pain was too much. She stepped onto a ledge 14 stories up. She remained there for about 20 minutes. She was staring down at the pavement. She wasn't screaming. She was just waiting. The police arrived. She was talked down. But the secret was finally out. The girl in the portrait had collapsed. The near-suicide attempt was a wake-up call for her family. They realized the previous treatments had failed. Later that year, Jean was transferred to the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. This place was different. At Menninger, they rejected the electric reset. They believed in milieu therapy, healing through environment, work, and simple daily routines. Jean Tierney had survived the darkness. Now the long road to finding herself again could truly begin. There were no more shocks. Instead, Jean was told to work. She was given chores. She gardened. She scrubbed floors. She had to make her own bed. For the first time in her life, Jean was treated not as a star and not as a debutante, but as a human being who needed to learn how to live. Dr. Menninger challenged her. He forced her to confront the guilt she carried over Daria. He made her look at the handshake incident not as a sin she committed, but as a tragedy that happened to her. He began to dismantle the perfect girl persona that her father had built. Jean spent over a year at Menninger. It was a slow, painful thawing. The memories didn't all come back, but the ability to feel, to cry without shame, to be angry at her father, returned. As part of her reintegration into society, the doctors suggested something radical. Jean should get a job, a real job. So in 1958, the star of Laura walked into a local dress shop in Topeka, Kansas, and applied for a position as a sales clerk. She was hired. She worked for minimum wage. She folded sweaters. She helped women choose sizes. She swept the floor. It was the most surreal performance of her life. Customers would walk in, look at the woman behind the counter, and freeze. They would whisper, Is that Jean Tierney? Jean didn't hide. She didn't deny it. She would simply smile and say, Yes, I'm Jean. Can I help you find something in a size 10? The press eventually found out. The headlines were sensational. Movie star working as clerk. But to Jean, this wasn't a humiliation. It was a liberation. For the first time, she was useful. She wasn't being valued for her glamour or her bloodline. She was being valued because she showed up on time and did the work. The old money princess who had been forbidden from working by her father was finally earning her own keep. It was the most dignified she had ever felt. In 1958, she met W. Howard Lee, and they married in Aspen, Colorado, in 1960. He was a Texas oil baron and had been married to Hedy Lamarr, and he offered Tierney a quieter life away from Hollywood. He didn't want Jean Tierney the star. He didn't care about the Kennedy connection. He saw the woman who had survived the shock treatments, the woman who had worked in a dress shop, the woman who was fighting for her sanity, and he fell in love with her. Jean was terrified. She told him, "I'm broken. I've been in a mental institution. I have a disabled daughter." Howard Lee looked at her and essentially said, "I don't care." He offered her something no other man, not Cassini, not JFK, not Ali Khan, had ever offered: safety. They married in 1960. Jean moved to Houston, Texas. She stepped out of the spotlight and into a life of quiet domesticity. She became a housewife. She played bridge. She supported local charities. To the world, it looked like she had retired. But Jean knew the truth. She hadn't retired. She had escaped. She had finally found a place where she didn't have to be perfect to be loved. By 1960, Jean Tierney had survived the impossible. She had lost her father's love, her daughter's mind, her own memory, and her career. But in the quiet heat of Texas, she began to stitch the pieces back together. The fragility of blue blood had shattered, but something stronger had formed underneath, the resilience of a survivor. However, the story wasn't quite over. Hollywood, the beast that had eaten her, was not done with her yet. And Jean, now armed with the truth of her past, had one final role to play. Not as a character in a script, but as herself, a woman ready to tell the world the truth about the madness of fame. In 1962, Hollywood held its breath. Jean Tierney was coming back. After years in the asylum, after 27 shock treatments, and after working as a sales clerk in Kansas, she returned to the industry that had almost destroyed her. But this was not the naive debutante of 1940. This was a survivor. She didn't need the money. Her new husband, Texas oil man Howard Lee, was wealthy. She didn't need the fame. She returned on her own terms to prove a single point: I am still here. I survived. Her role in Advise and Consent was small, playing a Washington socialite. It was a role she was born for. The critics were kind, but they noticed a change. The ethereal quality was gone, replaced by a distant sadness in her eyes, the look of someone who has seen the bottom of the well. She made a few more films, but she quickly realized that Hollywood hadn't changed. It was still a machine designed to consume people. After a brief return to film in the early 1960s, she gradually stepped away from Hollywood and lived mostly out of the spotlight. She retired to Houston, choosing bridge games and quiet dinners over red carpets. She chose reality over the illusion. For a decade, Jean lived in peace, but in 1979 she decided to break the final taboo. In old Hollywood, mental illness was a dirty secret. Stars were exhausted, never depressed. They went to spas, not mental hospitals. Jean shattered that silence. She published her autobiography, Self-Portrait. She held nothing back. She detailed the handshake that disabled her daughter. She described the heartbreak of JFK, but most shockingly, she described the horror of the shock treatments. She wrote about memory loss, the fear, and the degradation of being locked up. It was a bombshell. She became a beacon for the broken. Thousands of letters poured in from people suffering in silence, thanking her. The fragile debutante had become a warrior for mental health. But just as Jean found peace, the world twisted the knife one last time. Agatha Christie, the queen of crime, had heard Jean's tragic story about the fan and the German measles. It was so horrific that Christie used it as the plot for her novel, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. In the book, the actress realizes the truth and murders the fan. In 1980, the novel was adapted into a film starring Angela Lansbury and Elizabeth Taylor. Jean Tierney had to watch her life's greatest tragedy turned into popcorn entertainment, but she didn't break. She didn't lash out. She simply accepted that the public owned her story, but they no longer owned her soul. In 1981, Howard Lee died. Jean was alone again. She spent her final decade in Houston battling emphysema, the result of a lifetime of smoking, a habit she started as a teenager because studio executives told her to lower her voice. She died on November 6, 1991, less than 2 weeks before her 71st birthday. Her daughter Daria, the innocent victim of that fateful handshake, outlived her, remaining in care until 2010. Jean Tierney's life is a testament to a brutal truth. No one is safe. She had every advantage a human being can have: old money, a Swiss education, and the face of an angel. She was supposed to be protected by her class and her wealth, but money couldn't stop a virus. A famous name couldn't stop a father's greed, and the love of a future president couldn't overcome the politics of religion. The blue blood armor was as thin as paper, yet Jean Tierney was not a victim. She was a survivor. She crawled out of the wreckage of her own mind. She traded the gilded cage for real life in a dress shop in Kansas. In the end, she wasn't the girl in the portrait, passive and perfect. She was Jean, flawed, broken, stitched back together, and finally, miraculously, real.